In the previous video, you saw an overview of some of the basics of the requirements of consideration. We talked about consideration kind of being defined as a bargain for exchange and went into some detail over what we meant when we're talking about exchange and what we mean when we talk about value. In this video, I want to just do kind of a short overview of some key problems that can come up when you're looking at consideration issues. And generally, there's three. We have kind of a specific name for them. So you may have seen this in your readings, or you can expect to come across these three terms anytime there's any discussion of consideration as the legal doctrine. And what you'll see as we walk through is that each one of these three implicates either the question of whether value is being given or whether there's a bargain or an exchange there, or sometimes even both requirements. So these are really just kind of three specific types of problems that can come up where we cannot say in legal terms that we have either a bargain that we have either an exchange or that we have a value truly being given as part of the current deal. So past consideration, this was mentioned briefly in the previous video, but again, our idea here is that we cannot use value that's been given in the past as consideration for a new contract bargain. So any new contract, and that includes contract modification, which also becomes a problem in the pre-existing duty rule. But any new contract needs to have new value that is being promised as part of the exchange that's taking place. All right. The second concept is kind of closely related, but there's a real it's kind of an old common law rule called the pre-existing duty rule, and it sort of developed its own kind of special name because it is such a common issue that can arise in contracts cases. Some of these consideration issues, right, you can kind of see where they become, frequent problems because in some ways these are cases where it sort of looks like, oh yeah, well, we've got an agreement, right? It looks like you should be okay, but examining more closely, we identify some sort of a problem. Past consideration is kind of like that too. But the pre-existing duty rule, the idea here is that, again, you need to be creating new duties or new rights as part of any new contract obligation. You cannot rely on obligations that you already have for some other reason. The kind of classic sort of easy example that people give of pre-existing duty rule would be, let's say that your house is on fire. You call 911. The fire department shows up, and the chief, of the chief firefighter comes to you and says, "Hey, here we are. We've got all our trucks here. We've got the hoses. We're ready to go. We will put out the fire here in your house if you pay us $1,000." Okay, right. Same idea, right? Imagine calling the police to investigate, a burglary or a crime that's happened at your house, and the police show up and say, "Hey, we'd be happy to investigate this crime and, make sure that your house is safe, the criminals are not still inside, but we will need you to agree to pay us $1,000 to do that." Another simple example: if I say to the class, I would be more than happy to continue teaching this course for the rest of the semester if each person in the class will agree to pay me $5. In every single one of these examples, my agreement to continue teaching the class, the firefighter's agreement to put out the fire, the police officer's agreement to investigate a crime, all three of us are already employed to do exactly what it is that we're promising to do in exchange for the payment of additional money. We already have contract obligations through our jobs to perform the duties that we are, promising to perform at this point forward. Because of that, we're not giving up any kind of a right. We're not taking on a new duty in exchange for the payment of money from either you and your $5 as a person in my class, or the homeowners in the examples of the police or the firefighters, right? That payment of money is not really getting you anything that I wasn't already obligated to do. So those are kind of examples, common examples of the pre-existing duty rule. Now, one place where you really need to watch out for pre-existing duty rule problems is whenever you're dealing with contract modification, and this is mainly in a common law of contracts issue. We'll see that the UCC actually modifies this rule a little bit, but the common law was actually super picky about a lot of these contract elements, whereas the UCC has kind of decided to be a little bit more flexible. But one of those areas is watching for the pre-existing duty rule in any kind of contract modification. There have been some cases, for example, where, well, let's say you're hiring a contractor to build a house for you. And so you have agreed to pay the contractor $200,000, and the contractor is going to build the house according to plans that you've both agreed on. Now, you may have a situation where a couple months in, the contractor has started building, and maybe there is, for some reason, some kind of unexpected, unanticipated shortage of a building material. So let's say that it's suddenly way more difficult to get bricks, or it's more difficult and expensive to get wood that's needed to build the house. Well, if that happens, the contractor's expenses may go significantly up. And at that point, that may either cut into the contractor's profit or may totally make it to the point where the contractor would have to actually complete the house at a loss, right? If he's just charging that $200,000 purchase price. So there are some common law cases where, in examples like that, the contractor went to the homeowner and said, hey, here's what's going on. Would it be possible for us to agree to a higher purchase price just to make sure that I can actually cover my expenses? In those cases, wanting to preserve the relationship or just deciding to be nice about it or whatever, there have been cases where the homeowner said, yeah, sure, so they'll agree to like a $230,000 purchase price. Well, for whatever reason, later on comes time to make the payment, and the homeowner now refuses to pay the additional $30,000. Well, there were some cases where the contractors would go and try to enforce that promise to pay the additional $30,000, and the courts have actually ruled in common law contracts such as this, the courts generally will rule against the contractor in favor of the homeowners and say, look, what you were trying to do was called a contract modification, right? If you're modifying the purchase price on one side, you need to, even to modify a contract, you need to have consideration as part of the contract modification agreement. And the obligations, right? Note, the obligations of the builder did not change. The builder is still doing exactly the same work. The homeowner is just being asked to pay more. And in that case, you only have additional value as part of that contract modification coming from one side. You don't have an exchange from both sides. And so we'd be looking at a pre-existing duty rule here, right? That the contractor's obligation is the same as it was under the original contract. There's already a duty to build the house. There's nothing new that's coming in as part of the contract. Now, some of those cases, I think part of the rationale for that is that there were cases. In my example, it was a legitimate, fair discussion. There was arguably a good reason why the contractor was asking for more money. There have been cases where the contractors were kind of exploiting the situation and were not being so straightforward. I think there were some old cases where, picture something like the installation of a pool, right? So there's an agreement. A company's going to come in and install a pool in your backyard. They'll dig a massive hole, right? They'll agree maybe to a $10,000 purchase price. That's the deal. They'll dig this gigantic hole in your backyard, rip everything up, and then be like, oh, actually, well, we need $15,000 now, or we need $12,000 now. And there's really no justification for it. But now the homeowner's in a position where it's like, if I want to get this work completed, I either have to now go out and try to find somebody else completely brand new to do this and start from scratch, or just suck it up and agree to pay the extra $2,000. And that's, I think, part of the rationale was they're having cases where people, tried to take advantage of being halfway through a project. But on the other hand, there are a lot of situations where there is a very reasonable agreement to modify a contract, even if it is one-sided. And there may be good reasons for doing that. The common law still kind of follows the very strict modification rule. The UCC has walked back on this just because it is so common to see parties kind of, make a modification that's one-sided in contract situations. And so we'll see where that comes up later on. But certainly in common law contracts, it's definitely something that you want to watch out for. Final concept here are what we call illusory promises. When I hear illusory here, I think like an illusion, right? So these are cases again where it kind of looks right. The illusion is there that we've got consideration, that we've got a valid contract, but really when you look a little bit deeper, it turns out no, there's some kind of a key problem. Illusory promises, this is the other one that can come up in the employment context quite a bit. And again, it's relevant to the question of bonuses. So in terms of kind of one of the key cases where this came from, there have been some cases where an employer will tell employees, we will be awarding $500 bonuses at the end of the year, or $500 Christmas bonuses if management believes that it's warranted, or if it's financially feasible or whatever. In those cases, later on, where the employers have determined, no, we're not going to award the bonuses, there have been attempts, right, where employees have tried to sue to enforce the payment of bonuses. The problem is, and the reason that we call these promises illusory, is that they're really not giving up anything. They're really not making any commitment when you've got one party who's fully reserving the right kind of to change their mind, right? So when I say if management thinks it's warranted, right, that right there demonstrates if I have the full right to take it back and say, no, I'm not going to follow through with the promise, we can't sit there and say that that's a consideration type of an issue, because I'm really not making any kind of a commitment at the time I'm making that promise. Another possibility too, another possible challenge, concern in those kinds of cases is that's another thing that may fall into the pre-existing duty rule, right? I mean, that sounds kind of similar. I mean, aside from the illusory promise issue, right? Even if I commit to $500 bonuses, that could fall potentially under the pre-existing duty rule, right? If I say, just for doing your job, I'm going to award a $500 Christmas bonus, you may have an uphill argument trying to say that that's a contract, a binding contract commitment, right? Of course, the employee is going to say, yes, I agree, right? I want that $500 bonus. But if the employee is not taking on any duty to do something new, to take on a new obligation, well, at that point, you got to ask yourself if that's going to be enough to qualify as new consideration. My guess is that it would not be. Now, of course, if you're promising to award bonuses to people who are doing voluntary overtime, or who are exceeding sales, let's say sales goals or other kind of performance standards, that potentially maybe you could have a situation where that type of a promise could be binding, as long as you're not falling into this illusory promise territory, right? So as long as it's not, well, if management thinks it's warranted, as long as it's not too qualified, and again, as long as we're seeing new duties being undertaken, okay? All right, that wraps us up for our kind of common consideration problems and some case examples. And so from here, we'll turn to examining our final elements for valid contracts, capacity, and legality.